Good morning, good day, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Igor Kotler, and this um, symposium is organized by ICDD, the International Council for Diplomacy um, and Dialogue, which is an international organization. Uh, and this organization was established 2 years ago by Professor Stephen Bronner, who's here, and by Eric Gazlan, who's here. And Steve is in the United States, Eric is in France. And the goal of the organization is to do public diplomacy for different struggling, conflicting, and warring um, sides and parties. And we did a lot of work in different regions of the world with Yemenis, with Lebanon. We are trying to find a common language for Azeris and Armenians. We working toward some other conflicts. Now, Eric went to Guinea to work on the local issues. So this is an organization, again, which try to help sides to negotiate, to find a common language, very, very different sides. And this is one part of our organization. The second part is educational part, and we believe that education influences politics and societies, and this is very important thing. And among different aspects which we discuss at the organization is anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, because it's very important to struggle against anti-Semitism, which is becoming a more and more an issue in the world. And also this organization, this symposium was supported by the Museum of Human Rights, Freedom and Tolerance, which is museum which I led, and by the International Center for the Holocaust and Genocide at the Russian State University for the Humanities, and Dr. Ilya Altman, who is one of the participants. So this is symposium number 3, and the final symposium. And it's my pleasure to see the very international team of speakers, okay, here. And our goal today, we're not going to solve all the problems, this I know for sure, okay. We'll try to discuss the pressing issues of the Holocaust education, and we face a lot of challenges in this area, different challenges. First of all, I will say historical challenge, because this event is falling back in this history. We are in the 21st century. It happened in the 20th century. We have millennials for whom it's the last century. They don't know much about that. We have Holocaust denial. We have many, many, many different issues. And of course, the Holocaust education is a very important thing. There are achievements, there are failures. And I want our speakers today to address their perspective on this. Again, achievements and failures, but not only to talk about results, to give us your opinion about perspectives. What should be done in this new society? The new society with in the internet, with Instagram, with maybe less reading, more visual, and so on and so forth. You know all these problems, and let's address this in our like friendly conversation discussion. And I'm going to moderate this. We'll stay within 10 to 12 minutes maximum for each one. I would like to leave room for the questions and answers. It's very important. And in the future, of course, this symposium is going to be downloaded on YouTube, okay, for a wider audience to see it. So, and we have some other ideas, and we'll share later about if they're going to be practical. So this is the very beginning, and I would like to start this conversation by introducing my old friend, okay, Professor Jonathan Sarna, okay, And I'm very, very happy that we are not only kind of colleagues, but also friends. And Jonathan visited me back in 19, I believe, 85 in Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg. I was a refusnik. It happened into my life. Jonathan came to me, encouraged me to stay firm. And after that, I came to the United States, and he played a very important role in my professional life. Okay, and we still are friends and colleagues. And Jonathan Sarna is a university professor and Joseph Bella Brown Professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University. And he directs its Schusterman Center for Israel Studies. Jonathan authored dozens of books, authors and edited dozens of books, and one of the leading American Jewish historians. So, Jonathan, it's
Thank
my
you.
pleasure for you to open
Well,
up our conversation.
well, thank you very much. And I want to say I've given a lot of lectures, but this one is a special pleasure because I've known Igor, as he says, for 35 years, and to think how far things have come from when we were together in what was then called Leningrad until today is, I think, to inject a notion of hope into anybody's life and conversation. And it's really especially wonderful to see you here. Now, I was asked to talk about Holocaust memorialization in the United States. And in many ways, it's a story with two beginnings. The first memorials, which began even amidst World War II, in other words, before the full extent of the horror was known, the first memorials focused on heroes, especially heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto. And later, other heroes were added. Chana Senesh, the Beis Yaakov students who chose suicide over dishonor. The whole story has been called into question, but similar heroic tales. The early memorializations were largely organized by survivors, their relatives, and in an interesting way, they echoed traditional forms of Jewish martyrology. Then in the 1960s, Holocaust memory was really transformed, partly, I think, in America under the influence of African Americans and the study of slavery. And there was less of a focus on heroes and more of a focus on victims. Same thing happened in the study of slavery. An earlier generation focused on those who led slave revolts, and later on, the focus shifted broadly to slaves as victims. So it was with Holocaust memory. So we stopped highlighting those who fought back and resisted, and new commemorations memorialized those who perished. Crucially, these new memorials provided a platform for survivors to tell their own stories, to personalize the Shoah, to bear witness. And of course, Elie Wiesel came to personify this new form of memorialization. He was, among many other things, a master storyteller, and through his voluminous writings and speeches, he modeled the technique of the survivor as witness. He understood also that the story of one person could illuminate the story of 6 million and with much greater emotional resonance. Now, in time, first dozens and then hundreds and then thousands of survivors began telling their stories in classrooms, in synagogues, uh, at Yom HaShoah memorializations. Indeed, the typical Yom HaShoah memorial, roughly now for half a century, has featured a victim of the Shoah, and our understanding of victims is very broad, everything from survivors of the camps to German refugees from the 1930s to people who escaped into Central Russia, even journalists who covered the event, and of course those who spent the war years in hiding, but all of them together would appear as witnesses telling their own story, and it was very successful. Through them, the post war generation came to experience. They experienced Shoah, they understood through the eyes of these witnesses what the Holocaust was. In some ways, they experienced Gevurah as well, how ordinary people heroically survived and rebuilt their lives. In other words, a typical Holocaust memorialization program exposed the audience both to the depths of human depravity, illustrated by the Nazis, and to the heights of human resilience, illustrated by the survivors themselves. And as I said, this proved a great success for both sides. Um, I think many of the survivors learned invaluable communication skills and truly found new meaning in their lives. Why did we survive? They said. We survived in order to communicate the story to young people. And they found new meaning. And through what they did, they became much more deeply integrated into the American Jewish community uh, by these presentations. And of course, really two generations of post Holocaust Jews and non Jews met survivors, heard their unforgettable experiences, and were moved and influenced by them. Later, many of these presentations were taped and filmed. Today, we have a very large set of libraries of survivor testimonies. Um, and things like the Yale archive and the Spielberg archive. And this, of course, generated many, many long term benefits. I'll say, just in passing, I wish that Russian speaking Jews would emulate some of what the survivors did and educate the American Jewish community about the experience of people like Igor and what it was like to be a refusenik, and how world Jewry intervened in the greatest human rights success of the post-war era. The whole story is being forgotten, and young generation doesn't know it, and much can be learned from what happened and how survivors taught and witnessed the story, much could be learned for other groups, including Russian speakers. But as Igor already hinted, today we face a serious problem. 76 years after World War II ended, the number of survivors inevitably has diminished, and no longer memorializations, they can't find people to bear witness the way they did in the past. The most famous survivors, including sadly now Elie Wiesel himself, have passed from the scene, and we truly stand at an inflection point in Holocaust memorialization. And now, this was entirely predictable and should have been better planned. After all, actuarial tables don't lie. For some years, I have been myself telling audiences how fortunate we are that the exodus from Egypt did not depend on survivor testimonies. In other words, uh, uh, it's not on Passover that we listen to survivors of Egyptian slavery. Quite the contrary. There are no testimonies, not from survivors, not from their descendants. But we remember the Exodus, and this is the point, because a ritual was created. And as part of that ritual, every Jew who celebrates Passover imagines that they personally experienced the Exodus. They reenact the Exodus. They study the Exodus. They recount it to their children. It is remembered. It influences Jewish memory, but it doesn't depend on survivors and their children bearing witness. And the great question um, uh, for those interested in Holocaust education, it seems to me at least, is whether we can now successfully ritualize the Holocaust, much as we did the Exodus from Egypt. Remember, there are other tragedies of Jewish history, the Crusades, the expulsion from Spain, even the horrors of World War I, that in the court were in their time remembered and recounted, and people thought they would last forever. But actually, they weren't remembered because once the survivors and their children passed from the scene, there was nobody to bear witness. So, in my view, we need to ritualize the Holocaust, learning from the Exodus, really, and we need to challenge the most talented and creative young minds today. And it may be using the very technology that Igor referred to figure out how do we ritualize the Shoah now that the generation of survivors has passed from the scene. The post war generation figured out. They figured out when to commemorate the Holocaust, and they ensured that its stories, today primary sources, would be preserved. Um, and there's a tremendous, more than any tragedy of the Jewish people, and maybe more than any tragedy in history, we have documents from the Shoah. The great task, it seems to me, of the next generation is to ritualize the Holocaust and to ensure that even when all of the survivors and their children and their grandchildren are gone, memory of the Holocaust will not be forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think it's very good beginning for our discussion. Okay, and you pointed at many achievements, and actually, you pointed at some very interesting points how it should be memorialized and not forgotten. And now I would like to go to switch to our second presenter and Professor Stephen Katz. And uh, ironically, because I have some kind of relations with many of our presenters, like I met Jonathan in Russia and I met Stephen maybe before, but really we interacted a lot 3 years ago in Moscow. Okay, and found, I believe, common language and many interesting points of discussion. And Professor Stephen Katz is the Alvin and Shirley Slater Professor of Jewish and Holocaust Studies in the Department of Religion at Boston University. He served he serves on the academic committee of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. He published many books, extremely important in the area of genocide and Holocaust, and many articles. And I'm very pleased again to give the floor to Professor Katz. Stephen,
Thank you, Igor. I should begin with the obvious, which is that nobody at this symposium needs to be persuaded about the importance of Holocaust education. And the general public too understands that, as testified to the fact that billions, literally billions of dollars all over the world have been spent on Holocaust education in the last 75 years. Yet, in spite of all the money that's been spent, the success that we've had is only marginal. I know from my own students and teaching the subject almost 50 years that the outcome is depressingly modest. If you ask students who've gone through these formal routes in American schools, for example, that are mandated, you find out that the educational programs doesn't allow them to name even one death camp after they get out of the class. They don't know who the main actors are. They can't tell you what the dates are. And most importantly, in a way for us, they can't tell you anything about the Jewish side, know nothing about anti-Semitism, know nothing about Eastern European Jewry. So these gaps are extraordinary and they need to be noted as fundamental. They even can't tell you what it means to talk about the endlosum, the final solution. I want to begin, therefore, by trying to identify 3 or 4 items that are responsible for, in part responsible for this difficult outcome. The first is the time spent on Holocaust education mandated is just simply too small. You can't teach the Holocaust in one 30-minute lesson or 40-minute lesson or 2 of them and so on. It's impossible to produce an adequate knowledge in the present format. So we have to think about new formats, different ways of doing this. One might be trying to integrate Jewish history more generally into general history. There are other suggestions, but I raise this as a crucial issue. Secondly, and equally important, we're faced with the fact that the people teaching the Holocaust are themselves ignorant of the Holocaust. The teachers are simply illiterate, even though they've had some minimal, very minimal training. The fact is that if you look at the competence of Holocaust teachers, you'll find that they don't know much about it, that what they do teach is often incorrect. For example, surveys have shown that Holocaust teachers can't tell you how many Jews there were in Germany in 1933. Holocaust teachers can't tell you how many Jewish children were murdered during the Holocaust. In both cases, only 1 in 10 teachers got those questions right. In addition, there's another problem with the teaching that's done. Jonathan mentioned memorialization, mentioned my great friend Elie Wiesel. But the fact is that in many places, Holocaust education is constitutive of reading Anne Frank. If you go in the summer to Amsterdam, you'll see it's the only building open after 5 o'clock. People waiting in line. They don't know what they're really looking at. And Ellie's Night. The fact is, you're not going to learn all that you need to learn about the Holocaust from Anne Frank and Elie Wiesel's Night. They're important, certainly, but they don't give you the broad learning that you need to have to know something authoritative about the Shoah. Thirdly, the way it's taught is very perfunctory. There needs to be a way of conveying this information that has some impact on students, not just being told dates and names. In this regard, I would say there's a very profound gap in dealing with the personal issues of autonomy. What is it to be autonomous, to act freely? What does ethical behavior require? What are the subjects that bear upon this? How did religious communities interact in this world of mass death? Also, there's a profound misunderstanding of race in the Third Reich. Race comes in many forms today in the United States and elsewhere. We're wrestling with the deep issue of race, but race has different meanings in different places, and it has different constructs and different consequences. Hitler's radical view of what race entails, not only the color of your skin, the color of your eyes, but the rise and fall of nations, the success and failure of states, all based on race, needs to be understood. And of course, it's not because the teachers who teach it don't know it. Also, I would say, which is a kind of corollary of this point about race, is that we do too much relativizing. We're always looking for the universal. But when we look for the universal and we look for the analogies, we lose sight of the distinctiveness of the Shoah, the unique character of the death camps, the unprecedented nature of the Einsatzgruppen. None of this gets conveyed. This is a very special history. So what do we do? How do we improve this? First, I would suggest that we look at creating courses, chairs even, in colleges of education. Schools of education should have positions for people who are professional Holocaust educators, and those people should be teaching courses that every college of education student has to take, and not for 1 hour or 2. In addition, we need to do, I think very importantly, create summer institutes. I've been involved in many of them. Did one in South Africa for a number of years through the University of Cape Town and the Mendel Center. And they work to a degree because it's a deeper immersion. Jonathan Sarna oversees a very important summer seminar, Schusterman seminar on Israel. Has a big impact. So that is a crucial suggestion I would make generally, is these kinds of additional educational possibilities. In addition, we must work to overcome the general malaise, the failure of teachers to master any kind of reasonable content, any substantive amount of content regarding the Shoah. Also, we need to pay attention to how education is done or not done, how it affects the individual, what it has to do with his personal or her personal identity, what impact it makes in that regard, and this on both Jewish and non-Jewish students. What does this affect in their personality? We have to remember a crucial principle, I think a truth, that Holocaust knowledge by itself will not change personal beliefs. That to change personal beliefs that students come to class with, we have to think about ways of getting into their neshamas, into their souls, not just giving them some historical information. Moreover, as a corollary, I would say educational knowledge, knowing X or Y, is not the same thing as understanding. You see Holocaust curriculum all over. I'm often asked to judge for states and others. You never see the word understanding. You see what they're supposed to be taught. But the fact is, there's a low correlation between education and understanding. You need to increase the level of understanding. The key point is that not that students should be able to identify Janusz Korczak and Adolf Eichmann, though it's important that they know that, but that they understand why one is a great hero, a moral hero, and the other is a moral monster. That should be a large part of what they're taught in our classrooms. Also, we need to emphasize the inviolable freedom that every person has to act responsibly. And we have to pay attention to the rescuers, to the non-Jewish altruists, to the people who helped save Jewish lives. And everybody has to be taught that they have enough absolutely essential personal responsibility. I'm always reminded when they ask the survivors, why, the rescuers, why did you do it? They said two things. One, we couldn't do anything else, and it was the right thing to do. They have learned that lesson most profoundly. They didn't need to be given statistics and numbers. So I think we have to think a little bit more about not only the educational content, but the affective, how it impacts students, and redesign courses accordingly. That plus additional time, additional teacher education, summer institutes and colleges of education might begin to make a little bit of a dent. Thank you very much.
Steve, thank you very much. It was, again, very profound, very important, and all these points about kind of shallow education very often, and we know about that. And we have here Doug Kirby, who is the director of the New Jersey Commission on Holocaust Education, and he already talked at the symposium, and we work on that, of course, on different levels. And I believe it's very important what you said. It's extremely important. It's really came to my heart that we need to reach hearts of our students and their souls. It's very important. It's not just pure, dry historical information. Okay, it's very important. But now I would like to go to Robert Rosette. Robert is new person in my life, but actually always I try to find personal connections. So Robert, we have two connections. I can tell you which one. We are born at the same year, okay? It's number one. Number two, you used to live in New Jersey, you left New Jersey. After you left New Jersey, I moved to New Jersey, okay? So at least from this point, we are Laftsman. Okay, so, and now let me introduce Robert Rosette. Robert studied Holocaust under guidance of Yehuda Bauer, one of fundamental figures in Holocaust studies. And he's a senior historian at Yad Vashem. Okay, and now he can bring us perspective from Israel, which is very important. Okay. And Robert is focusing on Holocaust in Slovakia and Hungary, as I understand professionally, but also I believe everything. He wrote several books and prize-winning books. And now I would like Robert to talk to us about his views being in Israel and being at Yad Vashem, especially one of the most important and leading institutions preserving the memory of the Holocaust.
So thank you, Igor. It's nice to meet you this way. I hope we meet in person. I have to admit that it's quite a daunting idea to be sandwiched between Professors Sarna and Katz, and then my very good friend, Professor Barenbaum, and then Igor, and then Ilya afterwards. So it's nice to have a friendly discussion with all of these people, even if we're doing it online from different places. What I wanted to really talk about are 4 ideas that I've been thinking about a lot ever since I became the historical advisor to the Echoes and Reflections educational unit, which is something that Yad Vashem, the ADL, and the Visual History Archive at USC have been working on for many years. And the last few years, I've been involved in all kinds of efforts to make it better, I would say. And so I wanted to point out 4 things that I see as challenges that we have to meet. And in a sense, it will overlap a tiny bit, but maybe more complement many of the things Stephen just said in a, I guess, maybe more overarching way. So one of the things that I think we all need to deal with as educators now that we're 76 years after the events is the relevance of the subject. We on this panel don't have to be shown that it's relevant, but when we're talking to teachers out there in the field, and certainly their students, the issue of relevance is important. And I think very often the relevance of the Holocaust for many educators is the Holocaust in conjunction with other things like genocide or ethnic cleansing or crimes against humanity or general discussions of racism and prejudice and hate speech. And I think that one of the great challenges we have as educators and historians to deal with this is preserving the integrity of the Holocaust within those discussions. Because those are all legitimate things to talk about also when you're talking about the Holocaust, but there's a tendency for the Holocaust to get lost a little bit in some of these discussions. And so one big challenge is preserving the integrity of the discussion. When we also talk about relevance, one of the things that happens, at least in North America, that I've been witness to is that often the Holocaust is used for things like teaching against bullying. And so this is a real reduction of the subject. And of course, bullying is an issue. I'm not saying it's not, but using the Holocaust to educate young children not to bully, there's something there that always doesn't fit with me. And I think with many of you, you might feel the same thing. So again, how do we keep the integrity of our subject as it's interacting with some of these other things that make it more relevant to many of the people out in the field? The next thing that I think about a lot is context. And one of the problems we have, again, and I think Stephen said this so well when he's talking about the things people need to know and the information, the knowledge they need, we must present things we present in context. And I think that's one of the most important things we do. Just recently, the Israeli Academy of Sciences put out a report about teaching and research in Israel. And I'd like to quote, they said that there are 7 historical and ideological contexts that have been defined for which familiarity and understanding are essential for Holocaust research, and I would add education. So you need to know about Nazism and racism and anti-Semitism in 20th century Europe, the Second World War, genocide. These are all relevant to what you're doing. And then in addition, they said researchers need knowledge and familiarity in other topics like modern European history and the specific place they're looking at, and local Jewish history, sociology, culture, relations between Jews and non-Jews, the Jewish integration into those societies, the contribution to those societies. We need to understand wider national movements, inter-ethnic, inter-religious relations, political trends. It's a lot of things. It's exactly what Stephen was talking about. In order to teach the Holocaust, to present it, you need a lot of knowledge. And so this is critical in order to give the context. You need this kind of knowledge. And so that's a tremendous challenge that we all face. So there's ways to try to do this. I mean, not like Stephen also mentioned, these kinds of summer institutes. Yad Vashem's been running summer and winter seminars and about 70 international seminars a year, except of course now with the COVID, for many, many, many years now. And those are very important institutes where people are immersed for a week up to 3 weeks in the subject. In addition to that, creating toolboxes for teachers so they can go into depth on subjects in their own time. These are things we need to do. But again, we need to give a lot more to training our educators. They need to learn a lot more to do this well. And the only good part about the world we're in these days is we've all really gotten into Zoom, which means that our outreach is much farther than it was. And you don't necessarily have to buy a plane ticket and pay for hotel rooms in order to reach educators. There's other ways to do it today. So that might be one of the only good things we can talk about that's happened in the last year and a half, that we have that ability much more than we used to. The third subject I want to mention is complexity. The Holocaust is complex. It's not just the context. The subject itself is very complex. If you're talking about perpetrators, for example, there's a tendency only to see the Germans or to call everybody only Nazis. We know there's many kinds of perpetrators, a range of perpetrators motivated by a range of things, everything from racial Nazi ideology to very everyday things like greed. I mean, and many things in between. And we have to be able to present that complexity, that perpetrators, there's many reasons why things they will bring to justify what they're doing. And then that gets to the question of, can anybody perpetrate a Holocaust? And of course, in much of the teaching, the conclusion is we can all perpetrate Holocausts. But I think that that's not necessarily true, because the Holocaust is of a time and a place and of a public discourse that was going on. So the other questions about that are reflected when you understand the complexity, and you get back to other questions about what you're teaching, so that they'll understand, again, not necessarily in every situation can every one of us perpetrate a Holocaust. It depends on other factors as well. And also when we talk about Jewish victims, the black and white views, they've changed. Jonathan began talking about the heroism and how everything was presented as heroic. Of course, we have a much more complex view of what Jewish victims are about, or what Jews are about. And we talk about things like agency now, and what kinds of agency there is, what people knew, how they tried to respond. And we see the Jews more as actors than we used to maybe 30 years ago. And I think this is a very important thing, again, of the complexity that we have to get through. And the same issues for world response. The world response of what to when, the timeline is important here, exactly who you're talking about in world response. Just to say too little was done too late, well, maybe that's sort of a general idea, but it's much more than that. So that complexity also needs to come through. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is something very different, but it goes back to what I was saying about perpetrators very much, and that's issues of values. And that when we teach about the Holocaust, one of the things we understand, I think, today is there was a shift in values that was going on in much of Europe. There was a shift. The Nazis opened a box, like the Pandora's box, and then people were able to put forth other values that maybe they already had or were afraid to put forth, but they came out very strong, so that you could say that protecting the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, was more important than anything else. And so that then justifies everything you do. So there's very important issues of values here. And although I am very reluctant to talk about lessons from the Holocaust, I don't like the term so much, I do believe personally in at least one very important lesson, and that's about human dignity and the preservation of life. Something I feel comes out so strongly from everything that I've been dealing with and that my peers have been dealing with over the years. So how do you teach the things you need to teach so those become values in our society? There really are values there are values you can't break. That human dignity is something you don't break. That's an inviolate value, and that human life is precious. How do we get those things across? I think those are big challenges that certainly go beyond teaching Holocaust, but they're very much a part of the teaching of the Holocaust. So again, what Stephen talked about so much about understanding, and then even deeper things beyond the understanding of the kinds of values that we think are important, that we think we need to put forth as educators when we touch this subject. Again, those values can come from many places, from religion, they can come from the Fundamental Rights Agency opening document, they can come from the American Declaration of Independence. You can find some very important common values in all those places, again, that talk about human dignity and respect for life. So anyway, those are some of my ideas about what are the challenges we're facing as educators today, and certainly as I can see it in the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And it's very important that you pointed out complexity, because sometimes we are losing this thing. We really don't talk about complexity. So many factors, so many actors, so many, I would say, features of this event. It's very important for Holocaust education. It's one of the, I would say, most crucial things, and which might be applied teaching and writing about that. So our next presenter is Michael Birnbaum, Dr. Michael Birnbaum. And again, on my personal level, I would like to say that Michael was my boss. This is very important. He was my boss, very good boss, and also my mentor. We used to work together at the Show Visual History Foundation, struggling with Hollywood. Maybe I'm wrong, but I was struggling with Hollywood. I don't know about Michael, okay? But doing a lot of historical research. And we continued our connection for many years. and we continue this. And again, we were in Moscow 3 years ago, and I'm very happy to tell that there is a publication of our proceedings in English and Russian, and Michael's article and both Steve's and articles are here. Michael Birnbaum is the director of the Sigi Ziering Institute. He is teaching at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles. He is a professor of Jewish studies there. He was an executive director and of the second edition of the Encyclopedia of Judaica. He was one of the, I would say, founders of the U.S. Memorial Holocaust Museum. He authored and edited also dozens of books, many articles. He's a public speaker and really one of model people in my life, I mean, in Holocaust studies. So, Michael, please, it's your turn.
First of all, thank you, Igor. I want to dissent on only one thing. Whenever Igor works with you, you're not his boss. You're not certain that he's you're sometimes certain that he's your boss, but that's a different story. Let me also apologize to my colleagues, which is that I had it listed at 11 o'clock West Coast time, and apparently it was 11 o'clock East Coast time. So I did not have the ability to hear many of my very distinguished colleagues and good friends. Let me talk about a couple of elements. I want to respond to Robert in 1 second by saying that I wish the Holocaust were not relevant. And that is that the most frightening thing to me is that the Holocaust grows in relevance year by year by year, but we're asking different questions of the Holocaust. For example, I find people very interested now in the interrelationship of the years 1918 through 1933, asking questions, for example, about the ineffectiveness of a polarized democracy that can't function and how that leads to the rise of authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. I find lots of people concerned about the racism and extreme nationalism that is taking place. Lots of people concerned about the loss of faith in democracy, and lots of people turning again and again to the Holocaust as a foundational experience. Would that we lived in a world where the Holocaust could be consigned to history and could be consigned to the past. And I kept thinking that the ideal ending of, and I think in museum terms, the ideal ending of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum would have been that we could have turned and said, that's how 20th century humanity behaved. We could not do this in the latter half of the 20th century. Never again was a serious statement about the world in which we lived, but never again is not quite a serious statement, and that we can say, we have to say it's almost never again and again and again, because genocide rears its ugly head. Anti-Semitism is coming up in a very distinct way, and therefore I'm less worried about relevance. I am worried about a very interesting tendency, which is the shift that is taking place in some areas where people are a little bit embarrassed to talk about the Holocaust, and therefore they diffuse and go over to genocide. There's a very distinguished master's program that used to have some of the most distinguished Holocaust scholars in the nation, and now is not teaching a particular course on the Holocaust, but is teaching genocide only. And that's because there are people there who are embarrassed to talk about the Holocaust, in part because they're embarrassed by the direction in which some Holocaust, political usage of Holocaust has taken place. We have to be careful of that. And part of the interesting thing is the Holocaust carries the weight which has allowed us to go into teaching other genocides. But the reality also is that we have 75 years of teaching about the Holocaust, which is not true about teaching of other genocides, nor of museum displays on other genocides, nor about films on other genocides. And consequently, we have a less skilled set in talking and teaching about other genocides. But there are people who are embarrassed to deal with the Holocaust, and consequently they take the Holocaust and they move it to genocide. But then on the other hand, there are people who are deeply comfortable speaking about the Holocaust. Let's also deal with a context where research is flourishing. Good books are coming out again and again and again. And all of us who work in this field know that we have a great deal of difficulty keeping up with the research because it's flourishing and because it's good and because it's productive. And consequently, we have to be able to transmit that to people who are Holocaust educators. And we're also dealing with the fact that there are two types of educators. There are those for whom this is a mission and those for whom this is a job. And for those whom this is a mission, there is an engagement with enormously creative work with regard to the Holocaust, the determination to study the Holocaust, to become better at studying the Holocaust. But for those for whom it's a job, this is one of the items on the curriculum that they have to check off. And when we have essentially mandates to teach the Holocaust, that's a mandate that's put in the hands of two different types of teachers, those for whom this is an opportunity, a mission, and those for whom this is a task. We need to increase training because essentially every time we train educators, there is the difference between the returns are multi-leveled because it's a difference between tackling Holocaust education wholesale and tackling Holocaust education retail. When we train teachers and we train good teachers, the result is that we are able to teach hundreds of students. And if we train one by one by one, the results are very important. So all of the educational programs have to be considered. I obviously work with museums, and I see the tendency in museums has been to move not from the Holocaust, but to move with the Holocaust into other spheres. And what we try to do is to make sure that they don't essentially do an injustice to the Holocaust, but we also can't have it, they're not wanting at this point to stay solely focused on the Holocaust. So there's what we would call Holocaust plus, Holocaust with something. And what we try to work when we work with them is we ask them to move with the Holocaust and not from the Holocaust. Examples: Cincinnati built something called a Holocaust and Humanity exhibition, in which we take some of the characteristics that led to the upstanders and we then focus that on the way in which society has had other upstanders in other opportunities. And we look at the human characteristics that are within them. Dallas, for example, moved from Holocaust to about 60% of the museum deals with the Holocaust, but it ends at 3 points. It ends with the Nuremberg trial, with the Genocide Convention, and with the International Declaration of Human Rights. Then goes into the 10 stages of genocide, which Gregory Stanton has made the hallmark of his work, but prefigures that by using that language as we reflect back on the Holocaust, and treats each of the stages as manifest in another genocide. It then moves to a section on America, which has American ideals, American reality, and American repair, something deeply, deeply important in American society today. But the focus is to move not from the Holocaust, but with the Holocaust, and with the Holocaust as the anchor. And there are legitimate ways of doing that. I have a philosophical point on that, which is that I think that we have to think of, in one sense, this generation's response to the Holocaust in a manner in which the biblical generation responded to the Exodus and to the experience of Egypt. And that is that we take a particular story which remains in its particularity, and we make it into a story that has massive implications for our ethics, for the way in which we treat each other, for the way in which society must respond. And we take the particular, make it universal without losing its particularity. And that's a dialogue and a dialectic that has to take place. Last point, there are those who are attacking Holocaust education because it hasn't cured the problem of anti-Semitism. And I think that those are false expectations. Holocaust education is not a cure, it's an opportunity. And it's also a very important opportunity to address certain fundamental issues in society. It is far enough away to be a safe opportunity to be able to deal with those issues in society. And it has had enormous success in fighting certain forms of anti-Semitism and certain manifestations. And I think we can take a look, for example, at the transformation in the post-Holocaust era within the Roman Catholic Church is one such example, which took away one of the foundational elements of anti-Semitism in Western civilization. So I think there are some danger points. There are certainly opportunities. There are clearly attempts at minimalization, falsification. The Holocaust is not about bullying. The Holocaust is much more complex, much more important. And it is our hope that good educational material, like good scholarship, like good films, drives out bad educational material, bad scholarship, and bad films. But we're certainly at a transition point, and the transition point offers opportunities, offers challenges, and shows us certain areas that can be deeply problematic.
Michael, thank you very much. It's also very profound talk, and the question of changing times and your focus on how we have approached teachers is very well taken, I believe, by everybody who's here. And by complexity, again, we talked about complexity and the new generation. Okay, thank you. Now, next is Ilya Altman, who is now in Moscow. And personal level, I can say that if I met Jonathan Sarna back in Leningrad, and if I met Steve Katz in Moscow, I met Ilya Altman in the United States. Everything was vice versa. It was in Prova. We attended the Holocaust conference in 1994. Since the time, we became close colleagues and friends, and doing a lot of things together. And Dr. Ilya Altman is one of two co-founders of the Russian Research and Educational Center in Moscow, Holocaust Center in Moscow. He is a professor of the Russian State University for the Humanities, and he teaches about the Holocaust, and he is the head of the International Center for the Holocaust and Genocide over there. Ilya authored books and teacher guides and textbooks, many articles, and he edited more than 80 books in the series called the Russian Holocaust Library, trying to really fill this lacuna which existed in the Soviet Union after the Holocaust until practically 1989, 1991. Okay, so Ilya, please, now it's your time.
Thank you, Igor. I think it's not a big secret that we are together with Igor, discuss our cooperation as minimum one time per week, sometimes 2-3 times in very close. So I know about the idea of this meeting today, but I was really happy. And now this is an evening in Moscow, so it's a good time for memories. I really remember it, how about 30 years ago, Michael Berenbaum showed to me on the table the future exhibition of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I remember it as about 27 years ago, 25 years ago, Stephen Katz visited our center and give a very important proposal that necessary to preparing teachers not only in the secondary school, but also at the university. With Robert, usually annually before COVID, our teachers visited Yad Vashem, and I have a chance to meet with him and discuss many questions that was interesting for us. So I would raise maybe development, our discussion, maybe raise some new question. What is really important for me today? The subject number one, this is maybe it will be like unusual. It is the term Holocaust in our research and education in Europe. As I have chance to see, not only in Russia, where the term Holocaust was unknown 30 years ago, was one of the reasons why our center that was born in the last weeks when the Soviet Union still exists, received the title Holocaust. It was my personal idea to mention this title in the of our center. After that, the term Holocaust appeared at the Holocaust of Russian, Holocaust of the Soviet civilians, became very, very popular. Now the situation a little changed because a new term, the genocide of the all Soviet nations during the Second World War, appeared in the public discourse. It's really have a dangerous for the Holocaust education because in our educational materials, in some speeches, very famous political leaders appeared the term that all Soviet citizens was equal victims of the Nazi. It's not depend from the nation, ideology, and so on. So we come back in the time where all Soviet civilians were the victims of the Nazi, and the place of the Jewish victims was not clear. But as I saw in many countries in the West, for example, in the Germany, the term Holocaust used as also all Nazi atrocities against civilian population. So the terms, I understood, Russia is not the member of the IRA, and everybody knows that the term anti-Semitism that was recognized by the IRA, developments to the parliament, public level, and so on. But for my opinion, now is the time to explain our teachers, first of all, our educators, what does it mean term Holocaust or Shoah, according to the resolution of the United Nations. Some specific, second point, this is specific in the question of the, as well, education and memorization in my country. The popular, the main point in the public discourse is the Soviet Union losses 27 million during the Second World War. In modern Russia, they declare very often that 27 million Russians was killed by Nazis. And today, when the question of the genocide of the civilians became one of the main direction in public discourse, Everybody knows that many years in the Soviet Union, in the like 20 years after independence of Russia, the main direction was a point of the heroism of the Soviet people, including Jews, the front, and so on. This is a very good example. The film Sobibor that was supported by Minister of the Culture, resisted in the Sobibor that was raised by Jewish officer Alexander Pechersky. It was clear, but about 1 year and a half, a new tendency that the Soviet civilians also was the victims of the genocide. And the term genocide became like the symbol atrocities, Nazi atrocities against civilians. And some new researches had happened in the place where Nazi and collaborants killed civilians in many places. It's not clear why it was necessary, but and one decision of the local court declare about the genocide Soviet civilians. And the place of the Jewish Holocaust in this genocide is not clear for today. This is a new, situation for us in our education. It also close to the memorialization. Memorialization, because today, with the support of Russian Jewish Congress, we started the project Return the Dignity, and built about 90 monuments in the place where Jews was killed. I think for Robert will be interesting that the information from the list of the names from Yad Vashem come back to the monuments where this Jews was killed. We mentioned the name, the surname, and the age of each victims from Soviet and Russian sources, as well from Yad Vashem sources. It's also sometimes was not easy to solve this question with local authorities, but we don't have problems before new tendencies. I mentioned that genocide against all Soviet people of Soviet civilians became again like the main direction of the policy of the memory. And it's very important in this situation. I absolutely agree with Jonathan when he mentioned that we should pay attention to the different methods how to present the subject of the Holocaust. We started 5 years ago the unique project Liberators, decide by the hands and thoughts of our students in all regions in Russia to collect the information about each liberator who came to Auschwitz January 27, 1945. Not only soldiers, but also doctors, also journalists who recorded the information about it. It's totally about 25 persons. Personal attitude, it's very important. We try to research about the nations of this person. And today we know that one of the main heroes who entered to Auschwitz January 27 was not a Jewish hero. It's sometimes appeared in the mass media about the Jewish officer Shapiro, Anatoly Shapiro, who opened the gate of the Auschwitz. According to the documents, Shapiro was not close to Auschwitz, but at another point. Who liberated? He was a Muslim from Dagestan. He was an officer and became later the general. And today all Dagestan know about it. And we hold the week of the memory last year. In all schools in Dagestan, they learn about the Holocaust through the personal biography of this school. May 7 this year, we opened memorial desk in the capital of the Tatarstan in Kazan, where died the General Krasavin, who was the chief of the division that liberated of the Auschwitz. So this is not only monuments in the memory of the victims, but also monuments of liberators. The title of the streets became one of our goals. Also, I absolutely agree that the question about racism among the nation, it's very important too. So Russian Jewish Congress holds some special project and preparing the exhibition that shown this event. Come back to activity of our center. This is next point of my speech. This is international cooperation. Also, as a part of our project Liberators, we preparing the exhibition. Firstly in English, it was opened at the headquarters of United Nations with assistance the Minister of Foreign Office of Russian Federation, Mr. Sergei Lavrov. And then this exhibition traveling through United States, England, and some other country. Now this exhibition was translated to 9 languages, was shown in 15 countries, in the parliaments of 7 countries, including Israel, Uruguay, Argentina, with different continents. And we used the history Holocaust on the territory Soviet Union. I think that it's not very good known pages of the Holocaust, and also the question about the liberation. What was interesting, I thought that the list of the Jews who were liberated at Auschwitz, January 27, should be existing and in museum in Poland or in Israel. No. And when we found in Japan, only one museum in Japan, when I visited it, not far from Hiroshima, I found on the wall the letter that Otto Frank wrote February 23, 1945 to his mother. And in this letter, he mentioned that he was liberated by Russian, and later he spent 6 months in the hospitals with Soviet doctors. This is only one example. Primo Levi is another example. And all this information, and it could be united, the approaches to the teaching Holocaust in the West and in Russia. And one of our mutual projects, we hold some very interesting mutual projects in preparing handbooks. 2 weeks ago, we in Germany was published handbooks together with Bad Arolsen Center of the documents about the Nazi. And now we are working with the New Jersey Commission for preparation mutual handbook about the Holocaust in the Soviet Union, roles Red Army in the liberation, one hand, and role of the alliance, especially from United States in the liberation another hand. And I think this is mutual approaches. It's very, very important. And come back to the idea that Stephen Katz raised in his first visit to Moscow during our first meeting. 2 years ago, we established in Russian State University of Humanities new master program, History of the Holocaust and Genocide. So we have 2 directions in Russia, learn and teach about the Holocaust and the part of the Second World War and role of the Holocaust among the other genocides. We are preparing the first handbook. It never exists in the universities. It's for me very important that the lecture for our students, some professors and doctors from United States, as Igor, as my colleague from Dallas University, have a chance to teach our students, and some other foreign professors also included. I hope development the program and invited everybody who participate in this meeting also to be our partners in this project. Thank you very much for your assistance.
Okay, thank you, Ilya. And you touched, actually echoed, and a very important point which Michael did about is Holocaust or knowledge about the Holocaust, I would say, significance of the Holocaust is diminishing, or should we go with the Holocaust and talking about other genocides? And we see in the context of Russia, sometimes something different and maybe a little bit artificial is replacing it, which is a very dangerous kind of direction. And we need to really think about that and to deal with this. So, and the last presenter is Professor Stephen Bronner. And with Steve, everything was okay. I met him in the United States, okay, here in New York at the Rutgers University. And we traveled to Moscow too. What is different from all my friends here, with Steve also we traveled to Acropolis in Greece, okay. We had this kind of exercise with him and became friends, real dear and close friends and colleagues. Steve is one of the co-founders, as I already introduced, of ICDD, this organization. He is board of governance professor of political science emeritus at Rutgers University. Steve published more than 25 books of very different subjects, and he's in political science and political philosophy, and very active again at ICDD, working with different organizations, writing, giving talks. And so now, Steve, please, it's your time.
Thank you. First of all, let me say that ICDD is incredibly honored to have a group of such wonderful scholars. And I mean, this was really a marvelous exhibition of intelligence and commitment. If I make any criticisms, they should be taken in this. They should be taken in the proper spirit, because mostly I'd like to raise some issues for the future, and I'll try and go through each of you individually as best I can. If I leave something out, forgive me. I was very interested in Jonathan's discussion of the development of memorials in stages. And of course, this begs the question, why? Why did we begin with heroes? Why did we go to witnesses? And why did we why did we go from victims to heroes to witnesses? What was the historical context for that development, and how do we judge that? Because judgment is built, you'll have to excuse me, that's my dog. Judgment is built into the scholarship. You can't, it's an unavoidable issue. And I like this idea of ordinary people telling their stories, but I have to tell you that from the students I had and from everyday discussions, there, in my view, there are too many stories. My uncle was in Buchenwald, Auschwitz, Theresienstadt, and the Death March. He put up with a great deal. If you asked him to explain the way that the Holocaust worked, if you asked him to discuss a concentration camp and how it functioned, he would not be able to tell you, nor should he be asked to tell you. He was a simple worker and wound up there. He certainly can't have, there's no reason for him to have the type of expertise that all of you have. Genocide fatigue is a real issue because it's not just the comparison, in my view, between the Holocaust and other genocides. It's an almost overwhelming flood of information that is in a certain way a mile wide and an inch deep. And this is a very difficult thing to deal with. There are over 50,000 books written about the Holocaust. How do we judge which ones to use? In terms of what criteria do we want to lay down? And in my opinion, I think one of the most crucial things is that we need something more than a middle level theory of pedagogy of how to teach this. Whether one wants to go back to as far back as Rousseau, or one wants to go up as far as Otto Neurath, we have to begin to think about this in larger terms. And I think the reason is because the way we've been doing it, I understand the emphasis on hope, but I guess I'm a little more cynical about this. The Guardian in 2020 put out a long set of articles. Apparently, nearly 2/3 of young adults don't know that 6 million Jews have died. 25% think the Holocaust is a myth, and 11% think the Jews caused it. Now, those are big figures. We have a serious crisis, and I'm very sympathetic to the way Steve Katz laid this out. I'm not sure if one can ritualize the Holocaust. That'll work for those who are already in it. For those who, actually for Jews, not sure how much this would work. For someone like a student of mine who was in the Congo, who comes from the Congo, who of course, his ancestors suffered 6 million deaths too. And just as a simple example, as one of my colleagues talks about industrial killing, that never made much of an impact on me, because you can kill people just as easily by banging them over the head with clubs, as they did in Cambodia, as through industrial killing. I can't agree more on the teaching aspect that Steve brought up. The amount of time spent on the Holocaust is too small, not enough time. And I'll give you an example. I was very involved in the movement of the 1960s. And in Germany, and also in France, one of the slogans was, "Where were you, Daddy?" People, intellectuals, told me that when they were in high school and below, the class would start with, I don't know, Beowulf, and then wind up a while later with Bismarck. You know, there has to be, indeed, as Steve suggests, a mandate on the Holocaust. And I think it's absolutely right that the teachers that I've met, especially high school teachers, know virtually nothing about it. Not only do they know virtually nothing about it, they know virtually nothing about how it came to be, which leads me to a second thought. I think if you're going to talk about the Holocaust being relevant today, and you're going to talk about, as Robert did, its ethical import, we have to see the Holocaust as resistance, or I'm sorry, as the Holocaust as demanding resistance. History is not the story, in my view, of, how should we say, the universalization of integrity, or as the story of defense, the story of humanism or human dignity. Hegel had it right. History is a slaughter bench. And if we're going to talk about dignity and we're going to talk about these values, which I think we should, we have to do 2 or 3 different things. One is to talk about it in terms of resistance. Secondly, to talk about it in terms of the type of regimes which tend towards genocidal actions, and those that don't. In other words, and in the same degree, we have to talk about those groups which are primarily attracted to fascism and neo-fascism, and those which aren't. Because you can find, for example, in the United States, going back to the know-nothings up to today with Trump, you can find the same areas, basically the same class base, and very similar ideological preconceptions for all these movements. I think you can do that in Germany as well, which leads me to the universalism question. That, I think, is also very important, as Robert pointed out, and actually as everybody pointed out. This is not just an issue, though, from the outside. I grew up in Washington Heights, which was at that time something very different from Lynn Manuel. It was all German Jews, all German Jewish exiles. There wasn't a person I grew up with, at least whose parents I grew up with, who didn't lose somebody in the Holocaust. The slogan with every event that was reactionary or dangerous was "Genau wie beim Hitler," which means exactly as it was under Hitler. My father used to say it, and he was a very, very shrewd person on politics. We have to show two things, I think, and some of you pointed that out, I think correctly. We have to show the Holocaust is universal, and we have to show it as particular. This is not a question of writing, of being like Plato and going from a small event to a large event. That doesn't work. I think we have to show in the works themselves that are chosen, which is why we need the criteria. We have to show what is the unique character of the tension between the individual in this context and the mass. And to me, the guiding work that shows this, they're not many. I think they're very few. But one that does is Andrei Schwartzbach's great The Last of the Just, which I consider personally the greatest of the Holocaust novels. It seems to me also in this regard, Robert's quite right about the teaching not to bully being an example, the Holocaust being used to show that. I mean, that's ridiculous. And I think one should show why. And I think also that Michael's point about people being embarrassed to talk about the Holocaust is absolutely right. Because what we have is a multiplication of guilt for a multiplication of groups that have happened since the Second World War, each of which has its own Holocaust. And we have to deal with that. We have to be able to explain why it is that somebody from, not simply from the United States, but starting in the United States and going to Western Europe and going beyond it, why they should find this relevant. That's not a self-evident issue. If every group has its Holocaust, so to speak, we have a ghetto. We have ghettos full of Holocausts, each of which is concerned with its own. And at the same time, publicly pronouncing its concerns about the others. It seems to me that we have to take head on. And this means also recognizing, if I can put it this way, that the numbers don't work here. 6 million Jews, yes. Ilya mentioned 27 million under Stalin, but you're talking under Mao, you're talking about 60 million people. That's 10 times the amount of people who died. Those issues have to be taken into account. And it seems to me the only way you can do this can be done. Of course, this I can't lay out now, but I think we need, one of the things we have to do absolutely as a first step, we should be able to have a set of conferences or symposia or institutes, as Steve and somebody else mentioned, that speak about how do you make a general theory of the Holocaust that is relevant, that is contextually particular, and that shows resistance. I want to give you one example before I close up on resistance. What this means is that the Holocaust wasn't inevitable. It's up to us to show why not. And I don't know many people who can do this. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. In 1925, there was an election in Germany in which a fellow, interestingly enough, with the name of Heinrich Marx, ran for president against a conservative opposition. The Social Democrats decided to support him, even though he was a liberal. The communists did not. The conservatives won that election roughly by the same amount as that of the communist vote. The guy who was brought into power was Hindenburg. You can show similar phenomena in 1930 and 1932 in the elections. Yeah, and not only that, you can show in 1936, when the Popular Front emerged, that the Popular Front made it by the degree to which actual solidarity was achieved between different anti-fascist movements. Those are the numbers we have to talk about. And if we're going to talk about solidarity, universalism, we have to talk about solidarity in action, which means highlighting the politics. That's my view. Anyway, but I thank you for your indulgence.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. You summarized many words which was said here, and we have a few minutes, just a few minutes, 8 minutes actually. And if someone has a comment, please stay within 1 minute comment. If someone has a question to our participants, just a short question in order to accommodate. So does someone want to ask a question or to give a comment, but very short comment? Or everybody's happy and tired? Okay, Micheline, please. Micheline always has a comment. This is I learned from her.
It's a good one.
A good one. No,
I don't know. Don't raise the bar. No, very interesting discussions from all the panelists. Thank you for imparting your insight on the difficulty of teaching Holocaust these days, particularly this day, because we have a competitions of narrative. Many narrative claims that they have their own Holocaust. Just with I was reminding myself when I was to Sarajevo after the massacre of Srebrenica, and I went to a Jewish museum and I was looking for archives about people who have died in the Holocaust, and they told me which Holocaust you're referring to. They were referring to Srebrenica. And then it reminded me also with respect to the competition of narrative, when I used to live in the United Arab Emirates for 3 years, and in my course on the human rights, yes, I was teaching a course on that. There was, I also invoked the Holocaust, and my student raised their hand and said, Professor Ishai, what is it? We only know the Nakba. Okay, so I'm just giving you a sense of the competitions of narrative that is extremely difficult. The last part I wanted to suggest with respect to the competitions of narrative, how difficult that is to discuss about the Holocaust in that context. Second, we know we have the rises of nationalism, and with it comes in that same territory, anti-Semitism, racism, anti-Semitism, and otherism. And thirdly, the left has often camouflage, and I won't say everybody, but they've often camouflaged their own sense of anti-Semitism with strong criticism of Israeli politics, which often is identified as Nazi politics or sort of like Hitler is back, or I mean, you can see it now on the social media. It's everywhere with respect to what's happening in Israel and Gaza. And so my question to you: how do those experts navigate and talk about Holocaust when everybody is claiming that terminology, and when we have the victim of the World War II seen now as the perpetrator of another Holocaust? I don't subscribe to the latter, but I just want to know how
Who are you directing it to, Micheline?
To any of you wants to address.
Okay, so Micheline, so I understand that someone, Steve, Jonathan, I don't know where is Michael. Do you want to address this? But very briefly, please.
Let me say something, because I've worked in the area of comparison for a long time. Part of the problem, of course, is just laziness. People use a word, they don't know what it means. We've had examples where a union went on strike and the people who opposed the union were said to be committing genocide. So there's something you can't overcome when you're dealing at a low level with just general ignorance. But if you have a real conversation, a lot of the problems have to turn on the debate over the definition of the term genocide as found in the United Nations Convention on Genocide. And Lemkin, in order to make a broad statement, he said genocide is the destruction of a group in whole or in part. And that's what creates the dilemma. So you have to pay attention when people tell you about a Holocaust to ask them what part or what whole. So for example, you mentioned Srebrenica. When I went to interview the judges on the International Court of Justice in The Hague, they explained to me how they got to the conclusion that 6,000 deaths in Srebrenica was interpreted as a genocide. They invented a whole new theory that was absolutely inappropriate. One of the judges actually wrote a dissent. So you get into it and you find out that almost everywhere, the only Holocaust, the only genocide that is a in whole genocide, as a not in part, is the Shoah. So wherever you look, for example, today in America is a big debate about Native Americans in California. There was a book written, American Genocide, a few years ago. But the fact is, if you look carefully at California, you'll find out that there are 109, I think it is, reservations in California, right? That were created to provide some sign of safety, though the conditions were awful. Nobody was setting out to murder. So the two things you have to examine, Michelle, I think are the definition, and the other is intentionality. What is the intention of the victimizer, right? So for example, Black slavery is often now mentioned in America, but the intention of the slavers was profit, not corpses. So in fact, they did everything they could to reduce the number of corpses produced in the Middle Passage. So if you actually look at the Middle Passage statistics from the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, you'll see that they decline every decade, every century in significant ways because they're finding better ways. And one of the first populations in the world to receive vaccinations for smallpox were slaves. So you have to know the detail to recognize that the generalizations are largely, I think Steve said, a mile wide and an inch thick. I'm not sure they're even an inch thick. So the fact is, there are ways to rebut this, but it takes a little bit of time to master the facts.
Thank you. I do know the legal definition, but thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Steve. We have just 2 minutes left, and does someone
Igor,
else?
may I make a short comment?
Absolutely, Robert.
I just want to say that one of the things I think very much is that when these things come up, it's very important to make the point and that there's no competition about these events. It's not a competition. It's not a beauty pageant or a competition about what was worse. These events happen, but when you give an event a name, as we gave the Holocaust this name, Holocaust or Shoah in Hebrew, it's a specific event we're talking about. And that fits again in a specific time frame and context of why it happened and all these things that we try to understand about it. And when you give that name to another event, you're doing disservice to both of them because you don't understand the other event because you gloss over so many things about it that aren't the Holocaust, right? And when you talk about, again, spread out the Holocaust, so it's everything, you're doing a disservice to both. So part of the discussion always is that the need to, when you're having a serious discussion, of course, not with somebody that's manipulating, but a serious discussion, that these things aren't Holocaust, they're their own events. Let's understand that they might fit into a category of events, but they're not the same. And we have to understand that each event can have common elements, but they're not the same. So giving another event the name that for the event that we call the Holocaust doesn't help anybody anywhere. And so anyway, that's part of what I think whenever we have these issues to address, that if we're ever talking to a serious person, right, not somebody who's just, again, not a serious person about them, but somebody who's serious, to try to help them understand why it's not helpful to them either to start calling whatever they're calling a Holocaust.
Could I just add one quick point to Roberts, which is you should never, ever, ever get into a conversation where you discuss comparative suffering. You can't quantify suffering. The suffering of a Native American woman, the native populations of South America, Black slaves, East Timor, Rwanda, suffering is universal. We don't compare suffering. It's not that the Jews suffered more than another people. That's a crucial issue to avoid. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Yes, Steve, I would like to also echo what you said. I remember at one of the conferences dedicated to Holocaust and genocides, an Armenian colleague said from the podium that Armenians suffered more during the Armenian genocide than Jews. Why? Because Jews were killed by the gas and they were killed by the hoe. It was more painful death. I was absolutely shocked. You're absolutely right. We can't compare some suffering. And Robert, I agree with you. It's not like a nice event where we have more suffering and we were tortured better or whatever. Yeah, I agree 100%. There are similarities, there are differences, and it's very important to look at every historical event, this tragic event separately, finding, analyzing them. And this is very often is a problem talking about the Holocaust. Okay, it's a separate event like the Armenian genocide, the massacre of Assyrians, and there are unfortunately hundreds of them. But on this note, I would like to say thank you very much to everyone who participated. I believe that we covered a lot, really a lot, during this conversation. We will rethink everything, and like Stephen Bronner proposed, maybe in the future to come up with continuation of this conversation. I believe it's very good that we sit and we discuss this, and hopefully we'll make some more practical, I would say, conclusions from this symposium. And Steve, do you want to say something?
Just very quick for the practical conclusion. I think one of the ways of teaching the Holocaust that would be interesting and meet the new situation is that it's taught in a multimedia and multi-genre way. In other words, stuff that almost runs against the grain. Night and Fog as a film, The Deputy as a play, the etchings and paintings from the concentration camps, maybe a witness or two if he or she is there. The point is to sort of broaden the appreciation. I think the way you get specificity of the event is to show the totality as much as possible, the totality of its representations, for better or worse. And I think this might be a way to start.
Yes, and again, I would like to conclude our today's conversation. It was long, but I believe extremely productive. I hope so. And thank you to those who talked today with us, those who listened, and I believe we will continue this. It's very important and burning issue. Okay, thank you very much. Have a good time. We'll continue. Thank you.
Thank you.